Hello, welcome to your, what's the third video for the second retreat for the MAYM program. And we're going to be talking this morning about the first part. This is ideally goes along with your Friday morning discussion. Counseling Troubled Youth, a book by Robert C. Dykstra. It's a couple of years old now, but it's one of the best ones out there, I think, in terms of a rich approach to adolescence. It was written in 1997. But I have to admit that Dykstra is my own dissertation advisor from Princeton Seminary, so there may be a vested interest in this particular approach to adolescence as well. I wanted to mention my thoughts go out to you as you're facing the coronavirus pandemic. I don't know what shape it's having on your youth ministry or how it might be impacting you and your family. But I pray for you, and I pray that this season will be one where you can still find a chance to learn, and although we might not be meeting in person, that you might still gather something from these lectures and discussion that we have online that will be helpful for your youth ministry. So I would like to talk a little while about Dykstra's book, and I'll just draw your attention to maybe let's make some continuities across the class. This is in Retreat 2, and it's called Counseling Troubled Youth, but arguably this book is more about boys, perhaps, than it is about girls, and so we're moving essentially into the boys' development section. And you might be thinking about Dan Siegel and his approach to brainstorm and comparing Dykstra to Siegel. You might find if you did that you would find very different emphases in a book like Dykstra's Counseling Troubled Youth and Dan Siegel's Brainstorm. So you might be asking yourself, why these different emphases in the two books, in their contrasting pictures of adolescence? What would the similarities and differences be? I think it might have something to do with the method, the pastoral care method that's being used, and also the resources that Dykstra's drawing from. Versus Siegel, and so you might want to compare those and see how you feel about the resources that are being presented to you. So Dykstra says that youth are in particular trouble, and he wants to, even back in the 20th century, at the close of the 20th century, he wanted to draw our attention to the fact that youth are more exhausted than in the past. They found a loss of hope or faith, and they more likely to die by homicide or suicide. You might be thinking about some of the statistics that we were learning in the bulk reading. And he discusses the impact of teens in poverty. And really he asks us, is there some way in which that we're sacrificing our youth, are sacrificing youth to our society? And so he discusses how the entry point for youth into the lives of youth is usually done by Christian educators rather than pastoral care. And so pastoral care approaches are usually done on an ad hoc basis around a particular need, say sexuality or addiction or another aspect of adolescence. So you'll take a special topics kind of approach, kids in trouble or something like that. So, but Dykstra says that we can actually learn something more fundamental about young people and about the traumas of the contemporary self and culture with this focus on pastoral care for youth, where excuse me, I'm doing parenting and all the rest of it like you are, I'm sure. So Dykstra says that we can ask ourselves what the pastoral care of youth does to our whole notion of pastoral care in general. And he defines pastoral care as a practice of living with life's transcending limits of self. So he's thinking about in what ways are we both ourselves, and then we're these other selves that are held by God. So pastoral care for him is the care for the souls. And one way to care for the souls of young people is to look at your own youth, the particular suffering that you went through, but also look at the ways that youth are suffering now And he talks about his assignment of assigning to young people in his seminary classes the task of talking with youth at great length, as you will do in your final paper. And he says that inevitably, the young people said this was the longest time that someone had listened to them. And he reflects on that tragic nature. So how do pastoral caregivers, how do physicians of the soul listen to young people? And what are the particular dispositions that are required for this? Dykstra says it's kind of a hope against hope, if you will. You want to have hope, but you also want to be realistic about the sources of suffering that young people are feeling. He says that caring for these exhausted youth will create a confrontation for the church and its theology. So caring for the youth of today, particularly around the burdens that they carry, will create its own kind of theology that makes us reflect on who God is, on who the church is, and cause us to confront those who might allow youth to suffer in silence. So already you're thinking, for Dykstra, youth are really at the heart of pastoral care, or any pastoral care approach that doesn't attend to adolescence would be flawed in some ways, because adolescence is such an important time of life. So in the first chapter of his book, Dykstra talks about how we're facing a unique constellation of youthful despair, a factor of the troubled self that many young people face, even in a privileged context or wealthy nations. And he says that one way we need to look at this is just to explore how each young person is an authority in the subject of adolescence. So he says young people today are more than ever disrupted from their ancestral ties and out of touch with their conscience. And they're in a situation where they're kind of having to make up themselves in a new way. And he says he turns to Christian theology for this, and especially the theology of Jürgen Moltmann. And the category of Christian theology he talks about is that of eschatology, which has to do with last things or final things. And so the caricature of Christian eschatology is that it's all about heaven, which comes at the end of your life, and if you punch your ticket and you're a good person, you'll go to heaven. But a more complex notion of Christian eschatology is that actually heaven or the kingdom of God started to a certain extent with the life and death of Jesus, and then little bits of that kingdom become present in a young person's life in little ways that show, well, actually a little bit of heaven or a little bit of God's purposes are already here, just like we pray, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So in a sense, we're used to thinking of time as going in a calendar notion, heading towards the future. And in that sense, time would be futurum. Here I'm talking about, page 14 and 15. Futurum is that kind of calendar time that you can plan. And ahead of time, you can schedule it, and you can know what's going to happen the next week. And then every once in a while, a new kind of time breaks in, and that's called adventus. This kind of time disrupts calendar time, breaks it open, and you might have experienced it at a youth ministry retreat where you were involved for the weekend, and then you come back and you're like, how did all that time pass so quickly? I had no idea where the time went. That's because time was breaking in from the future and interrupting your present sense of calendar time. And Dykstra says that we don't really know who we are as a self. We kind of meet ourselves coming and going, but our self is both already and not yet. And it's almost as if our self is lodged in Christ as a promise. So the self is not rooted in the past, in childhood events, however traumatic, and the self is not entirely in the future, in something that will come to one and kind of upend one's life. But instead, the self kind of meets itself coming and going, and we don't always know who we are, but occasionally God breaks in and tells us something new about ourselves. And those are graced moments in ministry for Dykstra. Those are moments of adventus rather than futurum, when we can't just say who we are based on what we know about ourselves, but occasionally we find out who we are in a profound way from an encounter with God, an encounter with our neighbor, an encounter that disrupts our sense of time or shakes our sense of self. So in some ways, no matter how we try to understand the self, it's a mystery to us. And Dykstra says it's a mystery in part because our hope is rooted in Christ, who in essence has the promise of ourself before we ourselves are complete. And in the Christ event, and in encounters with the church and encounters with Scripture, the promises of God keep coming into our lives in these adventus moments that fundamentally give ourselves back to ourselves. So we don't know why it is, but every once in a while we'll be walking along in everyday life, and bam, out of the blue, we find out something new about ourselves, or there's a sudden miracle or realization, and the problem or the symptom or the despair that we had is no longer as present, and we're changed in some fundamental way. Dykstra says we can't understand that kind of change just from psychology alone, as helpful as it is, but that kind of change comes from the message and the proclamation of the Christian gospel, which comes to us as a gift from out of the future. In chapter 2, Dykstra goes on to give a pretty rich description of what's going on in adolescent development. And he focuses on the work of borderline theorist James Masterson, who talks about what happens when children have been abandoned by their parents. And it really creates a kind of abandonment depression in the young people. So I want you to think about a couple things as I talk about this chapter. Who are the psychological resources that Dykstra is using to build this picture of adolescence that he's building? And how might you bring those into conversation with other psychological resources from the class? Perhaps from those used by Joyce Ann Mercer or by Daniel Siegel. And if you do that for a while, or Greg Ellison in the next book reading, if you do that for a while, you'll see a certain picture of adolescence emerges from the stories we tell ourselves about adolescent development. So Dykstra's story is very rooted in mid-20th century psychoanalytic theory. And he says that when we grow up, we put little pieces of our parents in our hearts. We internalize them. Our parents or other significant caregivers. And then those pieces of ourself then come into conversation with ourself throughout our lives. And those are what's been called introjections. Fundamentally, the self wants to be filled with primarily good parts, but sometimes it's filled with bad parts or fearful parts. And when it experiences a lot of abandonment, it can't tolerate its own frustration at that abandonment, and so it splits the world into good or bad objects. So you can see this happening if you fail a teenager and suddenly you're an awful person, and you experience a lot of rage. Sometimes you're facing what's called splitting in that teenager. So a key question for an adolescent who has splitting in their personality is, can they tolerate the good and bad aspects of themselves or others at the same time? Dykstra talks about this psychological question that I really think is at the heart of development. And we're going to talk about his notion of development, and then we'll bring it into conversation with boys' development a little bit. So Dykstra asks, what do I have to do to be loved, and what do I have to do to be fed? And how can I put those two together? So the psychological self is asking about nurturance, and it's asking about comfort at the same time. And so that psychological question, what can I do to be loved, and what can I do to be fed, at the same time, then creates, if a child can't experience both those things at the same place, they kind of get frustrated, or they face abandonment depression, or they face splitting, and they split their lives into different parts in order to cope. Um, so we could get into the discussion of infant development, but essentially what Dykstra says is that the 18-month to 36-month window is really a crucial time in an infant's development when they start to take in little parts of their mother and father in ways that can be soothing to them. And they start to be able to remember their parents in the past. And they start to be able to put the present and the past together in a kind of whole sense of self. So during that time, if there's major disruption in the attachment relationships to a mother and father, then there's going to be a kind of a separation frustration, or abandonment depression is what Dykstra calls it. And what happens sometimes is that kids who are frustrated in that early stage end up withdrawing their approval, and so they no longer respond to the world. Or they close down and create a kind of a false self over the attachment needs that they had as children. So there's a tension between being loved and then being your authentic self. And a kid who is really cared for in those early months can both be their authentic self in a variety of places and not be as afraid of what's going to happen. And so we've already talked about this tendency to split, to relate to people in parts, and to kind of fragment your experience in order to respond to your world. So if you've split in a sense, there's good and bad people, and the ways that you respond to the world are kind of ways of managing that good and badness so that you can kind of stay above it all. So here's a kind of a breakdown of the psychological theory in Dykstra's book. He believes that when young people become adolescents, from children to adolescents, and then as they become adolescents into young adults, what they're doing is they're essentially reworking those early attachment needs of separation and becoming an individual, especially as they relate to the months, 18 months to 36 months. So if those were difficult months for a child will probably have a difficult adolescence, Dykstra would say. Kind of what helps and what hurts in this sense. What helps, it seems, is, well, Dykstra gets into this in other books, but not so much in this one. There's kind of a unique pressure on boys' psychology to separate from their parents much earlier. So there's an expectation that boys won't have the emotional needs for both loving and nurturing. The question, what can I do to be held, and what can I do to be fed? There's an expectation that boys won't have those needs for comfort and nurturance in the same way as girls do. And because of that, Dykstra says there's kind of a shutdown in the boy's self as the boy denies their own needs for comfort from parental caregivers and feels like they have to grow up too early, essentially. That boy code of being strong, of being invulnerable, of never showing need, all those things wrap together to make it very hard for boys as they become teenagers to acknowledge their need for both comfort and nurturance in the same place. And so what they do then is they kind of mount a defense that looks a lot like average boys' development. If you want to look at another book, it's The Boy Code by William Pollock, or in the African American community, The Cool Pose, to talk about the ways in which boys kind of silence their needs for emotional intimacy, affection, connection to others. And you can see this even showing up in the book like we read of Nancy Jo Sales, American Girls, for the last retreat. Some of the behaviors of those boys in groups could be just kind of interpreted as a denial of early needs for connection, affection, compassion, and instead kind of turning into the erotic world for those early attachment needs instead of meeting them in relationship. So let's talk a little bit about the case of Stan, which is arguably Dykstra's most important pastoral care case in this book. So Stan is a 19-year-old and who's come into counseling because of panic attacks. And he's had a recent loss, which is the loss of a girlfriend. Now, you might be thinking in pastoral care terms, this is such a normal loss or an average loss. Why does it require this kind of attention? Well, Dykstra says it's not just the loss itself, but it's the nature of how it's interpreted by the young person that matters. You might be thinking of the personal fable. So why would one breakup really cause an emotional disruption for someone like Stan, whereas a breakup in a different case or in a different biography might have different impacts? So Stan is kind of a tough guy, tattoos, very macho, but he also spills his guts right away. He's not afraid of kind of sharing who he is immediately with Dykstra. And Dykstra sees this as maybe a result of some psychological unhealth on Stan's part. He's very outward in his emotions, but there's no feeling attached to them. It's almost like he's acting out against the world, but he hasn't connected it to his feelings of hurt and anger. So his friend died, for example, in an overdose, and his only response, his response was no feelings at all. So there's a malicious rage that's kind of on the exterior, but it hides his feelings of vulnerability and the separation threat that occurred in his own childhood. So what you see, and this becomes really important, is that Stan's totally invested in this girlfriend relationship, and he actually idealizes her, but at the same time devalues her, and he goes back and forth really quickly between holding her up as perfect and then denigrating her. That dramatic fluctuation in his self is a sign of kind of an instability in his own representational world, or this the people in his heart that he can rely on, that he can talk to care for himself and soothe himself. And so he stops using drugs as a result of this relationship with his girlfriend. And so then the open question is, when he loses this relationship, how does that then impact his ability to cope? It kind of sends him into a tailspin or a depression or a panic attack, a space where his emotions have kind of, he's flooding because of all the things that he's denied are building up on him at once. So for Dykstra, this is a tough spot, but it's also the sign of a start of spiritual growth or a potential for the growth of the self, which for Dykstra has to do with being able to see people as good and bad, complicated, and not see them as all or nothing, which people who faced some abandonment, depression in their past tend to do. Okay, let's talk about chapter 4, and then we'll be done with this particular part of the lecture. So Dykstra turns to a kind of what sounds kind of strange, is the word narcissism. In chapter 4, self-psychology and pathological narcissism. And one thing that I think is especially helpful for us in the youth ministry world is his understanding of transferences, or how young people might use you as a youth pastor. They might look up to you in specific ways, and that's related to their own narcissistic need. So they might look up to you as kind of a perfect, or they might look up to you as someone who's kind of exactly like them. So you think about those two realms. You might have a youth who comes to you and thinks of you as perfect because of your ministry role and kind of lifts you up on a pedestal. You also might have youth who come to you and they think of you as kind of exactly like them. And so that's kind of a different kind of transference that occurs. They're seeing you as very similar to themselves. Well, how does this work? Narcissism, Dykstra jumps into the narcissism theory here and says that narcissism has to do with self-involved and arrogant persons who were absorbed in their images of their own perfection. And early on, in the psychological field, they decided that narcissists were too hard to treat because they couldn't create a relationship of trust with the counselor. And then what ended up happening was that narcissistic people ended up taking up all the therapy spots. And so it was like universally that was everybody who was being treated. Well, Dykstra wants to do a major reframe on this idea of narcissism. You hear about it and you think it's bad immediately, but Dykstra wants to tell you, no, it's actually good. And there's some particular reasons why. Your need to kind of be adored and held in esteem is rooted in your early relationships and your sense of continuity throughout the whole life. So there's like a healthy kind of narcissism that comes from valuing who you are and being able to hold on to your sense of self and being proud of yourself. It's much like someone might be proud of something, a work of art that they did, and when their parent puts it up on the refrigerator, there's kind of like an ability to take satisfaction in that praise. So people who are fairly secure in their own narcissism can take the praise. They can say, oh, that was pretty good. I'll admit that. Thank you for that. And they can kind of return, they can receive a compliment and say thank you for it. But people were noticing through the treatment of narcissism that there were a lot of people who had a very fragile or disrupted sense of self. People who kind of possessed little or no conscience at all and were constantly afraid of falling apart on the inside. And they would easily become attached to people in their own heads in fantasy, but without having the attachment to a person in real life. And so people who had this kind of narcissism, we might say pathological narcissism, would tend to connect really quickly with the counselor, but it would be a very intense relationship. And they would expect a lot from the counselor, and the counselor might feel afraid. And there's kind of three different ways that people who have this kind of flawed narcissism might operate. One, they might need perfect admiration from the therapist. You need to praise me and honor me in exactly these ways. Second thing they might need to do is express admiration for a perfect therapist. You're perfect in every way. You're a great counselor. You're a great pastor, what have you. And the third way is the belief that the therapist was exactly like me. Oh, I went through that already. And so if somebody kind of jumps on your story and says that you're exactly the same, that's a sign of the third type. So I'll go ahead and give you the name for these types. One of them is idealizing. One of them is mirroring, and one of them is twinship. So idealizing is the perfect adulation. Mirroring is the need to admire the therapist's perfection as a mirror for yourself. And the third was the twinship transference, the belief that the therapist's experience was exactly the same as the patient. So quick application to youth ministry. I think the mirroring and the twinship transferences are what you see a lot in youth ministry. So people will say to you, you're a great youth pastor, or they'll say to you, you're exactly like me. And according to narcissism theory, when you get that kind of compliment, you have to work really hard not to downplay the role that you play in that person's life, but just accept it and thank them. And what happens then is they take a little bit of you and they put it inside of them. So if you can accept the praise and gratitude of someone outside of yourself, then that shows a kind of strength on your part, and then you can honor the connection that you have to them. But what inevitably happens in counseling and in pastoral ministry is that people are disappointed in the ways that they've connected with you, and they feel like you failed them. And then what occurs for persons who have a kind of unhealthy narcissism is there can be these explosions of rage or shame. A person can kind of seem to check out in the counseling encounter, and you might feel bored or used by a client. I once had a dream when I was doing counseling that a client shot me, which was a sign, I think, of an unprocessed kind of rage on the part of the client towards me. So the treatment for narcissism, paradoxically, Dykstra says, is just to give the person exactly what they need. So if they expressed anger with you, the way to heal that is to listen to that anger, express how sorry you are, and give a space to it. So you heal the person by giving them exactly what they want in this approach. And what actually heals is experiencing progressive senses of failure in a relationship with someone across time, and you just hanging around long enough to be meaningful, to continue to be meaningful to that person. So narcissism is kind of what happens all the time to everybody. It's a need to be seen and adored and acknowledged that's universal. It goes off the rails when people experience strong failures in this area as children, and then they might project onto the world some really powerful qualities of a perfect parent, a perfect, you're just like me, you're my imaginary friend. So the main idea here is that in the care for young people who are troubled, you have to respond positively to these narcissistic needs in order for the client to feel cared for. So what occurs early on in this kind of care is a person feels really overtaken by feelings of shame and rage. And then slowly, as the feelings are processed, there's less explosions of shame and rage, and they're able to kind of bring a range of different feelings more easily into their lives. So signs of growth, if you're caring for someone who has these kinds of psychological difficulties, or if the person is somehow able to enjoy music or able to enjoy his or her own creativity, these are all signs of growth. If a person can start to have a sense of humor, whereas before they were overcome. So early on, so all this to say, Dykstra gives us a powerful image of troubled youth in America, young people who've kind of lost a sense of purpose, lost a sense of moral conviction or courage. And he says that what we have now is a crisis of meaning, where people are more and more empty, and they're struggling with feelings of emptiness. And he says that Christian ministry has to meet this new pathology of the self. Call it what you will, pathological narcissism or borderline disorder, the sense of not being a stable self. And he says that really a Christian notion of eschatology. So the Christian notion that God has promises that are bigger than any individual kid's life is exactly what they need to hear. So you might be thinking about kids across the young people across the class who we've heard about in different case studies, and you might ask yourself, what would it mean to meet their trouble with the kind of medicine for the soul that Dykstra is proclaiming here? Dykstra predicts that you're going to become important transference figures to the people in your care. They might look up to you. They might think you're exactly like them. They might have explosions of shame or rage when they feel like you failed them or failed to meet an appointment or something like that. And Dykstra says it's really important in those instances to both remain connected to Christ as the source of our life, or the life of the adolescent self, but also to kind of proclaim that mystery or that witness of who Christ is in the future for the adolescent self. So you might be asking yourself, kind of, what does this kind of trouble mean in the light of pastoral ministry with the kind of young people that you're caring for? And do you agree with the picture that Dykstra has presented? In what way does it make a difference to think about the eschatological self that he talks about, the self coming from the future with the promises of God? In what sense does it make a difference to talk about the sources of abandonment depression that many young people feel? And you might ask yourself if you agree with his conclusions on this. A major point for boys especially is that boys have denied a lot of their developmental needs to kind of quiet their emotional lives and become a part of the boy code. In order to not be bullied, in order to not be teased, they've learned how to cry. They've forgotten to cry. They've forgotten that they still need close relationships with parents of both genders. And when they deny those feelings, what happens is they become kind of monochromatic in their feeling tone. They don't have highs and they don't have lows anymore. And I think Dykstra's image of human development has a particular promise for boys who feel like they can't cry, who can't admit that they need their parents or their family, who can't admit that they feel alone. Dykstra invites those troubled boys to kind of find a voice for those feelings and reclaim them again in order to really fully inhabit the life of faith. My hope for you is that this is a season in your life where you're experiencing people around you who can listen to these needs for you, so you can feel less alone and less afraid, and you can feel kept in mind by others and by God. Thanks for listening to this first lecture on Dykstra's book, Counseling Troubled Youth, What's Inside of Troubled Boys.